hearing of the Subcommittee of State, Foreign Operations and Related Programs of the Senate Appropriations Committee will come to order. The subcommittee meets today to review strategies for advancing security and prosperity through international conservation. We have a terrific panel of witnesses, and I very much look forward to your testimony. Ms. Caldwell, Dr. Steer, Mr. Sabunya, I appreciate all three of you joining us today. I've had the chance to work with you and to review your testimony, and I'm very optimistic we will have a positive and constructive hearing today. I will note at the outset, some of my colleagues may be coming and going. There are conflicting hearings today. My ranking member on this subcommittee, Senator Graham of South Carolina, also happens to be the ranking on the full Senate Judiciary Committee, which is right now having a somewhat heated hearing. There is a chance I will step out to go to the end of that judiciary hearing, but I will only do so if another member comes to take over. So I think it is critical that we have this hearing. It is the first after our budget review hearings in which both the Secretary of State and the Administrator of USAID testified. I think this is a critical topic, critical for the United States' place in the world, critical for the relationship between the private sector and philanthropy and government. Those who have worked on, read about, or visited conservation programs know what progress on conservation means for indigenous communities, for efforts to curb wildlife trafficking and illicit finance and to improve security, and for the benefit of livelihoods across the globe, including here in the United States. That is why there is robust bipartisan and bicameral support for that. Like many members on this committee, I've had the opportunity to visit protected and conserved spaces around the world, from Kenya and Mozambique and Rwanda to Namibia, Colombia, and Ecuador. I have done them in partner with my colleagues, in partner with nonprofit organizations, and have seen remarkable and impressive examples of what conservation that is human-centered, that is done in close coordination with indigenous communities, and that is well-planned and well accounted for can accomplish. We are losing the Earth's most vital spaces, the most remarkable parts of creation at an alarming rate because of logging, rapid human population expansion, the demand for agricultural space, for charcoal, for wildfires because of a changing climate. This is in part because the vast majority of gazetted parks of notionally protected spaces are underfunded, leaving lands at risk of degradation and wildlife at risk from poaching. Poaching, which, as I've demonstrated in hearings now many years ago to lay the groundwork for the End Wildlife Trafficking Act, funds armed groups and global criminal networks that threaten national security, both here and in many countries around the world. USAID and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have long been critical partners in addressing conservation challenges, for which Senator Graham and I have worked to increase and sustain funding through this subcommittee over many years. We also recognize governments cannot possibly address this problem alone. I'm encouraged over recent years we've seen significant and growing commitments from philanthropic and private sector actors to support transnational conservation. I'm looking forward to hearing first about how USAID has applied lessons learned from its long history working on conservation and how we can strengthen such efforts, including in partnership with the private sector. Senator Graham and I, along with a bipartisan and bicameral group of my colleagues, have proposed legislation to leverage these philanthropic commitments, the U.S. Foundation for International Conservation Act. This legislation would fund new public-private partnerships for the long-term management of protected and conserved areas, catalyzing substantial additional private investment with a sustained ongoing annual amount of additional public financing. We'll discuss that legislation today and other steps we can be taking to advance our global conservation goals in more detail. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to your testimony. And my understanding from Senator Graham is that he will submit an opening statement for the record. So with that, I'd like to invite our three witnesses to begin with your opening statements. Ms. Caldwell, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Chairman Coons, and I'll recognize in absentia Ranking Member Graham and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. This hearing and consideration of the International Conservation Act come at an important time. Nature is facing grave and accelerating threats. As you are well aware, alarming declines in wildlife populations and the deteriorating health of our oceans, forests, and grasslands are nothing short of a global crisis. We are deeply appreciative of your powerful leadership in this area and your recognition of the burning imperative to address unprecedented biodiversity loss occurring at a speed and scale that is threatening to undermine the development gains that Congress and USAID have worked to secure over decades. As you explore how this proposed foundation could help address this crisis, I'd like to share 3 key lessons we at USAID have learned over more than 30 years about what works best for conservation. The first is one I know you're already deeply familiar with, and it's central to the Act. We must ensure long-term investment in priority places and habitats. The importance of long-term investment to specific protected areas and the communities that live in and around them cannot be understated. In key areas, USAID makes those sustained commitments, underpinned by rigorous measurement and evaluation. We have often funded the same partner for a decade or more, even while maintaining competitive procurement because it produces results. But we know that this kind of long-term conservation investment must also work for and with Indigenous people and local communities, which is lesson number 2. A prime example of this is USAID's work in Kenya, which began in the late 1990s in partnership with the African Wildlife Foundation and the government of Kenya. I'm very pleased to be speaking alongside Kadu Sabunya of the Africa Wildlife Foundation today. From those early years to now, we focused on strengthening local organizations. Today, we support the local Northern Rangeland Trust as our lead partner in the area. This decades-long partnership benefits 630,000 people in 39 community-owned and managed conservancies covering nearly 63,000 square kilometers, an area approximately 7 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. In addition, it has created jobs for more than 850 eco-rangers, reducing poaching and increasing the elephant, giraffe, wild dog, and buffalo populations. But as you know, communities, governments, and civil society organizations can't do this work alone, which leads me to lesson number 3. Broaden the funding base by engaging the private sector, another key proposed feature of your act. We know firsthand that private sector collaboration is critical to success in conserving biodiversity and advancing development gains more broadly. As of fiscal 21, USAID had nearly 100 active public-private partnerships in the environment sector, with every one government dollar matched by an average of $3.7 from the private sector. We know your act aims for a minimum of a 1-to-1 match, and based on our experience, you should be able to exceed that. A prime example of this is USAID's Hearth Initiative, standing for Health, Ecosystems, and Agriculture for Resilient, Thriving Societies, which is generating cross-sectoral partnerships with private sector partners such as Mars and Disney to conserve high biodiversity areas and improve the health, well-being, and prosperity of the communities that depend on them. 17 Hearth activities have been awarded as of March 2023, using $75 million in public dollars to leverage over $90 million of private sector funds with far-reaching benefits. For example, through the Gorilla Coffee Alliance in the Democratic Republic of Congo, USAID, Nespresso, and Olam Food Ingredients will invest a combined $12.3 million over 5 years to support shade-grown coffee production, sustainable agriculture, rural enterprises, improved health, and landscape-scale governance. Together, this will reduce drivers of poaching and deforestation in nearby Kahuzi-Biega National Park, home to most of the 6,800 eastern lowland gorillas. In conclusion, I hope I've given you an idea of how we're addressing long-term conservation efforts and where our experience would be helpful and complementary to the additional support envisioned and the new initiatives and private sector investments stimulated by the International Conservation Foundation Act. Private investment needs to significantly outpace government investment due to the urgency and scale of the crisis. The biodiversity crisis is happening now, and it's accelerating. The private sector, which relies on strong global economies and vibrant societies, needs to increase its investment. The cost of inaction is simply too great. Thank you to the subcommittee and Congress for your continued support of USAID's efforts to tackle these critical conservation challenges. We need your partnership to continue to draw on over 30 years on the ground in our partner countries to address this existential threat. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Caldwell. Mr. Sibunya.
Thank you, Chairman Coon. I recognize the ranking member, Senator Graham, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity. More than 3 million square miles managed as Africa's protected and conserved areas provide clean air, water, flood control, disease control, climate regulation, and a host of other life support services to billions of Africans on the continent. American support for balancing conservation and development on the continent is welcome and important. However, for this support to be effective, it must be tied to African perspectives, priorities, and aspirations. Experience has shown us that conservation characterized by isolated interventions parachuted in with well-meaning but extremely externally driven has been insufficient. African conservation requires investments in solutions that address complex realities and rapidly emerging conservation challenges facing the continent and its leaders. Addressing these challenges requires building African practitioners who are rooted in their communities, landscapes, and social and political contexts. Leaders who can develop locally relevant solutions and national movements that collectively have the potential to bring large-scale change. These leaders can be your partners. It is my conviction that the survival of a healthy ecosystem in Africa hinges largely on one factor: linking Africa's conservation agenda in meaningful ways to the aspirations and mindsets of African people. I believe that the solution to conservation in Africa is in finding the balance between conservation and development. I'm certain that effective conservation must reinforce and complement economic development. Support for conservation shouldn't be only for animals and their habitats, but for putting in place sustainable economic models that empower people and allow nature to thrive. Therefore, the conservation money on the ground in Africa should promote democracy, reduce threats to terrorism, provide nature-based solutions to climate change, advance green growth and economies, and increase state security. The good news is Africa is already aligned to conservation approaches to deliver this. In July last year, at the first ever Africa Protected Area Congress, Africa agreed to an African-led conservation plan that provides an unparalleled opportunity and means for the U.S. to engage with Africa and hold us accountable for conservation and development at a continental level. I believe that to secure protected areas, you need an investment ratio of $1 to $2, meaning for every dollar spent inside a protected area, you need to spend another $2 outside. That investment in communities around protected areas is how AWF has been successful in securing wildlife habitats. Protected areas across Africa are the size of Australia. Largely the budgets are ineffective. Mostly are managed at $50 per square mile. In comparison to Yellowstone, managed at $3,700 per square kilometer. I've personally worked on US-funded programs that build lasting, impactful African environmental institutions with USAID, Peace Corps, State Department, and other US entities. We created the environmental authorities across Africa in the 90s, creation of ministries of environment in the 80s, national park services and wetland authorities. Those investments are what helped in protecting 30% of the global biodiversity, now under threat on the continent. Thank you, because we need the US to continue to lead. It allows us to put nature at the center of cooperation on economic growth, climate mitigation and adaptation, a sustainable energy transition, conflict resolution, prevention of future pandemic, and the reduction of terrorism. I would like to thank the subcommittee on state foreign operations and related programs for this opportunity. The U.S. Foundation for International Cooperation Act has a potential to be transformative influence in international conservation landscape. But for this new mechanism to truly succeed, it mustn't perpetuate past mistakes. The African Wildlife Foundation looks forward to continued partnership on this ambition, but promising the journey together. I thank you for the opportunity, and I wait for answer your questions, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sabunya. Last, we turn to Dr. Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund.
Thank you very much, Chairman Coons, Senator Schatz. It's an honor to be with you today. I'm Andrew Steer, the President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. Prior to this, I was President and CEO of the World Resources Institute. The Earth Fund is a philanthropy founded by Jeff Bezos in 2020. Our mission is to allocate boldly and wisely $10 billion in grants by 2030 to reverse the loss of nature and address climate change. So far, we've pledged $3 billion in grants for nature, $1 billion to conserve the nature we still have, $1 billion to restore what is lost, and $1 billion to help transform agriculture to increase food whilst taking pressure off the land. We look forward to working in partnership with the exciting proposed U.S. Foundation for International Conservation we're discussing today. We're all very familiar with the accelerating loss of our beautiful planet, aren't we? The facts are stunning. Consider this: since 1970, one species, Homo sapiens, which is us, has doubled our population. During the same period, the total population of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians has fallen by more than half. We can do much better than this. There is good news. A large amount of our globally significant biodiversity can be found in a limited number of places, which makes conserving it easier. There's more good news. Last year, almost all of the nations of the world, including the United States, agreed to a global goal of protecting 30% of all the land and ocean by 2030. If implemented, this could be a game changer. We're learning how critical conservation can be in promoting security. Healthy ecosystems can withstand disturbances such as droughts, floods, and storms, which can lead to crop failures and other problems that can destabilize a country. Conservation can help reduce the risk of conflict over natural resources. Many conflicts throughout history have been driven by competition over resources such as water and land. Conservation can also prevent illegal exploitation of nature, which funds conflict and threatens security. Today, illegal wildlife trade is funding criminal networks and militias, and poaching is destabilizing economies, decimating iconic species, contributing to the spread of zoonotic diseases such as Ebola and SARS. There are numerous examples of how conservation can help create more stable and secure countries. In my written testimony, I give examples from Costa Rica, Rwanda, Namibia, and the Congo Basin. So conservation is a rare win-win-win. Why is it not happening faster and better? Let me suggest three things that are necessary to unlock more progress: finance, political engagement, and genuine partnerships between the public and private sector. The proposed bipartisan bill introduced by Senator Coons and Senator Graham offers all three. First, finance. There remains an urgent shortage of funding. Addressing this shortage by leveraging public with private finance is one of the best opportunities for the US government to enhance its leadership in protecting nature and improving security. Second, political engagement. While most countries have made commitments to increase conservation, many face major headwinds from vested interest. In our experience, it is highly valuable for such leaders to know of the support of the United States and to regularly participate in dialogue with senior US politicians. Whilst the proposed fund would be formally independent of the US government, it would have government leaders on its board and would benefit from regular engagement from leaders such as yourself. Third, partnership with the private and philanthropic sectors. Private philanthropy is willing to commit significant resources to conservation and plays a highly complementary role to public funding. They also like to work in partnership. For example, 2 years ago, 11 philanthropies, including the Bezos Earth Fund, came together to put $5 billion on the table to show our seriousness in advancing conservation. The work of these and other private funders can be even more effective if done in partnership with the proposed initiative. Both public and private can reach different places and influence different actors, and both will be more effective in the presence of the other. Conservation, of course, must be done right. It must be owned and driven by host countries, by local inhabitants and indigenous people. Too many efforts have failed due to top-down measures and a perception that conservation is imposed from Western countries. Conservation programs must focus on jobs and livelihoods. The proposed legislation would insist, we believe, on best practice. In conclusion, the United States has been a global leader in conservation for 150 years. When Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872, it was also the first such park in the entire world. When President Teddy Roosevelt created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 bird sanctuaries, and established the National Wildlife Refuge System, other countries took notice, and the best of them sought to emulate this leadership. The best of them still do today. There is a big opportunity today for U.S. leadership through the proposed U.S. Foundation for International Conservation. It can help reduce conflict and migration. It can improve economic opportunity and can enhance good governance and democracy. It can do this by conserving irreplaceable natural beauty, the diversity of life, and the goodness of God's creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel. We're going to start with a round of questions. I have one colleague with me now. We'll see whether we have others join. In the absence of others, I will simply indulge myself in a second round of unlimited length, I suspect. Dr. Steer, if I might with you, you cited some really remarkable, impressive numbers there of billions of dollars of philanthropy dedicated to conservation and to protecting biodiversity. What's the best argument for why there needs to be a partnership between government, philanthropy, and the private sector? Why is there a role for government in doing this? Why not simply rely on a handful of visionary donors, unrestrained by the vagaries of politics and the accounting and auditing requirements of spending public dollars?
Senator, I believe that the public sector can reach where the private sector can't. When I listen to the kinds of visits that you and your colleagues make, how wonderful it would be if those conversations that you have, which are already very effective, were backed up by serious resources that bring both the private and the public together. We are very, very good at financing non-governmental organizations. They have an amazing role to play, as we heard today from Mr. Sapunia, and there are many others doing world-class work. But the plain fact of the matter is, if we are going to be effective, we need to aim at every single level, including the very highest levels of government. And that's where you come in, and you are so very, very effective. And as I said in my statement, the United States has been a leader, and engaging at a senior level makes a huge difference. Also, I should say that you have the capacity, by putting relatively modest amounts of money in, to attract more private sector. And that's what the Germans have figured out in their Legacy Landscape program, where they actually match resources that the private philanthropy and private companies bring in. And it's really very effective.
Mr. Sabunya, you referenced the Africa Protected Areas Congress in Kigali, a critical convening in which you played a central role that called for increased funding for locally led conservation projects. And it's my sense, and all three of you have either referenced or directly testified this, that the funding gap for conservation is dramatic. It outstrips the capacity of any one government, even the United States government, any one national government in the developing world or in the global south, and any particular philanthropy. You also pointed to the critical role of indigenous communities in identifying, prioritizing, and leading human-centered development. I think in your testimony you said the fortress model of conservation has demonstrably failed, and we need a human-centered and indigenously informed model. How do you think we should come up with a evaluation plan, a selection plan that ensures local ownership, not just a seat at the table, but a driving role in terms of how sites are designed, projects are selected, they're prioritized, and they're maintained and then delivered over many years?
Thank you, Senator. I think that it's going to start by meeting the people where they are. In my travels in Africa and in my discussion with African leaders and community leaders, they are really spend most of their time dealing with their human aspirations, dealing with their livelihoods, looking at their ambitions. And I think tying the agenda we have for conservation as part of their aspirations and outlining that is going to be very, very critical. At the moment here, most of the discussions on conservation are political and economic. So the role of, and that's where the role of private sector and government is critical in reaching our goals. It's going to be the economy. And that's why we are suggesting if we are to secure a protected area, you're going to invest $1. But the $2 have to go to meet the economic aspirations that people are dealing with wildlife economies. And we're not talking about tourism alone, but how they are going to feed this huge population. How do we invest in sustainable agriculture? What value chains can we bring? What type of economies that are compatible to these wildlife areas? And I think that those $2 are most best suited to come from private sector, from impact investors, to support those value chains. But the government has a role in regulating, in creating policies that are aligned to community participation, building the right governance systems to the deals we want formulated. So it's that empowerment through economic and social discussions that are going to get us to where we are. And I think it's critical that this partnership of this foundation and the private sector is going to be extremely helpful in what we are trying to achieve.
Thank you. Ms. Caldwell, you laid out in your testimony 3 critical points. 1, broaden the base by engaging the private sector. 2, partner closely with indigenous communities. But in some ways, the central and long-term investments informed by rigorous metrics and evaluation. USAID has not always been known for the ability to sustain across administrations, long-term contracts, but you cited several very promising examples where you've accomplished exactly that. What, if any, challenges are there contractually, structurally, statutorily for USAID to do 5- and 10-year commitments? That is part of what this foundation model is designed to help facilitate, both the metrics and the long term. In discussing this with Senator Graham and with others on this committee and in the House, they've often cited the MCC as an example of something that through the compact process has rigorous metrics and long-term engagement. I couldn't agree more with your 3 central points. Help me understand what, if any, constraints there are on USAID being able to deliver on those long-term investments.
Thanks so much, Senator Coons. There's nothing that prohibits reinvesting after what is typically a 5-year investment in the programs that that we're engaged with. We do believe strongly in the importance of competitive procurements. We also believe strongly in the importance of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So funding in 5-year increments really allows us to kind of assess best practice, understand the impact, and make sure our investment is well placed. When and if that investment is well placed, they're obviously likely to succeed in procurement, and that investment continues in many instances. You also referenced swings in Congress and that challenge. Thankfully, our biodiversity funding has typically been able to maintain support through various administrations, but it is a real risk. There's nothing more important, I think, for us in terms of ensuring longevity as predictability. And many of our missions face highly unpredictable budget levels. So even while we may be able to sustain overall support under a given earmark, there may be congressional directives and top lines which skew investment into new directions where there may or may not be existing capacity immediately available to deploy. So I think thinking about not just sustaining and increasing this kind of biodiversity funding over time, but also enabling us to continue to invest in the missions that are really effectively delivering this biodiversity programming in some of the most biodiverse regions of the world is critically important.
Thank you. Senator Schatz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here to testify. I'm really interested in the testimony that talks about the fortress model of conservation. One of my proudest achievements in partnership with President Obama's administration and many, many others is the establishment of Papahanaumokuakea Marine Monument, and it's, almost 600,000 square miles. And I worry very much that it'll be a paper monument. And so what worries me a bit about the 30 by 30 is exactly that, is that the sort of geopolitical diplomatic impetus for an announceable will cause a bunch of people to declare a bunch of things off limits and will lack sufficient resources to actually manage those terrestrial ecosystems or ocean ecosystems. And I'm just wondering how we think about, I do think we should have these goals, but I could see a scenario where we superficially meet that goal and don't actually change conditions on the ground. And so I'd like each one of you to comment on that as quickly as you can. I'll start on my right with Dr. Steer.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Senator Schatz. The political attractiveness of 30 by 30 is useful, but it is useless unless it's followed up well. And the best examples of those need to be replicated. So, for example, in the marine area, the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape, where 4 presidents, Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama, got together last year and they said, let's do this, let's use this 30 by 30 as a way of getting political and other momentum. What happened is a lot of us were willing to sit down with them for literally weeks to design something led by them, including by the fishing industry. And it was so cool at the Biodiversity Convention up in Montreal to see the Minister of Environment of Ecuador, together with the Minister of Fisheries, which is extremely rare, announcing an expansion.
Oh, I know. When I was a freshman legislator 100 years ago, I was the vice chair of the Ocean and Marine Resources Committee, and I got the baptism in fisheries politics. So I understand what an achievement that is. And then Papahanaumokuakea, I think, is a great example of doing it right. I'd also, just before I move on to Mr. Sabunya, point out the emphasis on stakeholders who are indigenous is really important. I'm the chairman of the Senate committee that has jurisdiction called the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs that has jurisdiction over Native people across the United States. But I do want to emphasize that stakeholders are stakeholders whether they are indigenous or not. And I don't want to get into the blood quantum question or the question of whether you're a lineal descendant of the original people of a place. In all seriousness, it can become this dichotomy between indigenous and non-indigenous, just as, for example, when we established the Northwest Hawaiian Islands Marine Monument in Hawaii, we worked with a lot of the fishing community, not all of whom are Native Hawaiian. A lot of them are Japanese Americans and Filipino Americans and Caucasian Americans and all the rest of it. And so I just want to make sure that when we think about stakeholder engagement, it's not just indigenous, non-indigenous, it's anyone who's a stakeholder who may make a living doing something that is going to have to change. So, Mr. Sabunya, I actually want to ask you a slightly different question. Is there a sort of curated list of projects that were done right? Because I think that's maybe the most important thing. Rather than call out the projects that are done wrong, the model that Dr. Steer is talking about, Papahanaumokuakea is a good example, I'm sure. Across the African continent, there are examples, but I think it would be useful to the State Department and to the committee to kind of say, what's the model here and what do they all have in common? And I'm wondering if anyone has already done that work.
Thank you, Senator. And yes, there are a number of examples of projects that have done very well. And the issue now we are trying to deal with for our 60 years work in Africa is how do you scale that up at a level that is really impactful on the continent for an issue that is not only national but Pan-African, to have that high-level impact. I'll give you an example of the work we've done with the USAID in partnership with the government of Rwanda and Uganda around the Virungas, around the mountain gorillas. 4 years ago, we've been working there protecting the endangered mountain gorilla. We started by protection, that fortress idea, training rangers, park management systems, inventories of mountain gorillas. Then we started introducing tourism as an aspect to that. We, together with the USAID, we built the first high-end lodge in Rwanda and Uganda around the mountain gorillas. These 2 lodges are owned by communities. We raised the bar in terms of community participation. At that time, community participation meant getting African communities to dance for tourists or sell a few crafts, and that was called ecotourism. We built lodges with community equity in it, and then we brought in private sector as a management partner of these lodges. They still exist. The lodge in Rwanda pumps $500,000 in the rural economy in Rwanda around the mountain gorillas. Rwanda has picked, as a model, Rwanda has picked up mountain gorillas as part of their greener economies in the country as a model. Now, what have we achieved? Conservation of mountain gorillas. For the last 40 years, there's no single mountain gorilla that has been killed in both Uganda and Rwanda, except recently during the COVID, which was in self-defense. That is a very good example where we have tied the economy of the rural area people to be matched by the conservation aspects of that national park and the identification of their aspirations as a people in line with what's going on, what the ecological systems of this area is. Now we are dealing with the value chains. We are introducing bamboo economies in these areas so that people stop growing a World Bank project, which is pastoral and other agricultural products, to start growing bamboo as an agriculture economy, which is food for the mountain gorillas, but they're going to produce furniture, building materials.
It's $6 a square foot. It's a very valuable.
So that's a very, very good example of what it is, right from the national level economy to the community level economy.
Thank you, sir. My time is up. Ms. Caldwell, I'll reduce my question for you to writing and submit it for the record. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator Van Hollen, we had a memorable trip to view a community conservancy in Kenya outside of the Masai Mara, and frankly had one of the most impressive visits I've ever had to see that model, and then a chance to talk to then President Kenyatta about the importance of supporting and preserving community conservancies. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to your questioning.
Well, we did, and thank you, Senator Coons, for holding this hearing on this important subject, international conservation, the connection between conservation and security and prosperity, and thank all of you for being here today. I'm actually going to come back to the issue Senator Coons raised, but first let me just say we're focused on international conservation efforts, and of course it's important around the world and in our backyards. I represent the state of Maryland, and the Chesapeake Bay is an example of an ongoing restoration effort that we have to keep at, and we need to bring that same determination to some of these other challenges around the world, which is why I'm pleased to have led the letter seeking support for AID's budget request for biodiversity, and look forward to working with the chairman and the ranking member to achieve the budget resources that we need to meet the strategy. And I do want to say, I know there's been lots of conversation, important conversation about what happens when we destroy forests and put biodiversity at risk from increasing the chances of triggering pandemics and then spreading pandemics to obviously the challenge of climate change and what it means when you cut down trees that provide sinks. I do want to mention one other thing because it's another practical connection between protecting biodiversity and the health and welfare of people around the world, which is the development of drugs. And I would like to ask you, Ms. Caldwell, just to comment on that for a moment, because as I look at the figures, if you look at there are about 11% of the drugs considered basic and essential by the World Health Organization originated in flowering plants. And in the United States, 56% of the 150 most popular prescribed drugs are linked to discoveries of natural compounds found in the wild. At the current extinction rate, experts estimate the Earth is losing one major drug every 2 years. So could you just comment on this piece of the importance of biodiversity?
Well, I think you've already cited some statistics which strongly underscore the importance of biodiversity. Of course, Western medicine hasn't always acknowledged the relevance of traditional medicine or of nature, for that matter, and biomimicry in the context of responding to disease and really in terms of articulating solutions to so many challenges we face all over the world every day. There's also the major challenge that the loss of biodiversity, of course, decimates pollinator populations, which in turn has catastrophic impacts on agriculture. So to those senators that may be concerned that these biodiversity investments overseas don't hit home here, I think it's just so important to recognize that we are a globally interconnected community, that with the loss of habitat, we will see an increase in pandemics. As temperature rise, we'll see increasingly virulent viruses, and we will lose the biodiversity that our health and ecosystems depend on.
Now, I appreciate that. Let me ask you about one particular AID investment. I asked AID Administrator Power about this when she was here. I was on a recent trip that Senator Merkley organized, and one of the places we stopped was Indonesia, where we have an MOU in the works. I'm hoping it's going to be finalized or has been finalized. Can you provide an update to the committee on that?
Yes. So since you raised that question with Administrator Power, she did what the Minister of Environment and Forest was asking for was a review and acknowledgement that the MOU was something the administrator was prepared to sign. She did convey that preparedness, and we are now awaiting a signature. There was a small edit that the ministry wanted that has now been made, and we're hopeful that will be resolved very soon. I likewise had the opportunity to visit Indonesia and to see the important work we're doing in action, not just with the government-managed protected areas, but also with the set-asides within the palm oil plantations to ensure sustainability, and of course saw orangutans in the wild that are benefiting from that very intervention.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hadn't fully realized before that trip that Indonesia was the only place on Earth that is the home to orangutans on 2 of their islands. Mr. Sabunya, you were talking about the importance of preserving mountain gorillas, and I say amen to that. This was another example of working to protect biodiversity generally, but also to make sure we protect this very important species that's a fairly close cousin of ours. Let me just follow up with some of the issues that you raised and came up on the trip that Senator Coons and I took, as well as the issues with respect to Indonesia and other places around the world, which is in order to make sure that we discourage poaching and we discourage wildlife trafficking, we need to make sure that local populations have alternatives. And that means that they're benefiting financially and economically from the alternatives we provide. In Kenya, where we visited, they adapted a mechanism to make sure that the local population was benefiting from tourism, right? That not all the monies from tourism were flowing to a few people, but that the benefits were more widely dispersed within the community, which just seems to me an essential model if we're going to have a sustainable protection of biodiversity. Can you talk about some of the more, number one, do you agree with that premise? And number two, could you highlight a couple of what you think are the most successful examples of local communities benefiting from international conservation efforts?
Thank you, Senator. Is this working? Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Senator. Yes, I agree with you that unless people benefit, unless people lead our efforts, unless people are part of the management systems of our efforts, it's going to be very, very expensive for us to secure. The model we have that is being practiced in other areas other than Masai Mara, where we are building forts, islands of protected areas, is heavily expensive. There is no government or NGO, any partner who can run a protected area successfully without communities. From our research, tells us that with poaching, if you disrupt the information poachers rely on at the local destination, it's going to be very, very, very hard for them to be successful in poaching. But also, in order to disrupt that, we need to work and increase the value of wildlife in the eyes and of communities near these national parks. Currently, on average in Africa, a majority of Africans value a chicken more than a mountain gorilla, or a chicken more than a rhino, simply because they can pay school fees with a chicken. They can pay their medical bills by selling a chicken. They can't do that with a leopard currently in many of the areas. They can't do that with the lions in many of the areas. So the more we do programs that tie those economies, like you saw in your visits, the more successful we can be. Masai Mara is one of the examples, but there are several others that tourism as a business has helped communities benefit directly from wildlife. The challenge with the tourism is what we saw during COVID. It can shut down momentarily. And therefore, the diversification of those economies that rely on nature is critical for our success. We've seen that with tying agriculture products to the sources of water for that agriculture as critical elements in some of the discussions we are having. Tying the local employment into maintenance of the parks is critical to sustainability of wildlife economies in these areas. The regulatory regimes for that allows private sector landowners to manage wildlife profitably is also critical in those areas. And there are several examples across the continent. Senator.
Thank you. Thank all of you. And Ms. Caldwell, thank you and the administrator for finalizing the deal on Indonesia. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. I'd like, if I could just for a moment, Mr. Sabunya, to follow up on that point. I was struck at Akagera National Park in eastern Rwanda on a bipartisan, bicameral trip I led last August, at the number of Rwandans who were visiting that national park, transforming it from a park that had initially been gazetted and established under colonialism, but in its current leadership and its current structure, both the fee structure, the programming, the outreach, the engagement was designed to drive. And during COVID, a vast majority of the visitors were Rwandans, and that had been holding up even as the pandemic had receded. They also had a whole range of innovative programs, whether it was around aquaculture, beekeeping, harvesting mushrooms, the whole series of agricultural initiatives, so that it was not just employment in the park. The other thing that impressed me in Gorongosa, which really was in some ways the most significant model I've been tracking over more than a dozen years, was the profound investment in Mozambican leadership, not just being engaged on the periphery or at the entry level, but training a new generation of wildlife conservationists, of managers, of leaders, through a world-class training center. So I'd be interested if you would just comment on, I've been to conservancies in countries where the benefits to the folks of that country seemed modest at best, or more talk than reality. And I've been to some where it seemed to me that the local community really was directly benefiting, driving, prioritizing the activities happening there. How do we ensure that's what happens going forward?
Thank you, Senator. I think that that model you've just mentioned, Kagera and Gorongosa, is one of the models that has worked, and I think going forward is really that leadership element you've just mentioned, capacity element that needs to be accompanied by the foreign investments in these areas. The role of governments in building the value chains that support those investments is going to be critical going forward. The idea that these areas are part of the economic ecosystem of these areas, managing these areas as landscapes, as part of other entities within these regions, is also critical. We've done work in Tanzania where the areas of sugarcane producers of sugarcane that are found miles away from a national park, there is a realization that their sources of water is from this national park, and tying that sugar economy to the management park is so critical for sustainability of financing of these areas. So I think the future is really of those kind of models is I would say in three, mostly in three, summarize them in three areas. One, capacity of Africans to play the role they should play is critical. The role of government in regulation, in policies, in creating financial systems that allow private sector, environment that allows private sector to play their role is critical. And the other one is really for any entity like us, NGOs or private sector or government, to have an exit strategy so that when you train, when you engage communities, there is also a plan to exit and they see the future, especially the young Africans that are the majority on the continent. That's what they would like to see. They would like to see an end and them taking control over these elements.
I couldn't agree with you more that the core challenge is today the vast majority of the population looks at a chicken and says, I see value. I can sell eggs. I can eat the chicken. I can sell the chicken. And no value at all in things that are considered sort of iconic wildlife that seem to inspire the imagination and engagement of those who live thousands of miles away. Marrying those two so that there is real value that begins with local communities is critical. And over the dozen years I've been communicating with Greg Carr and others at Gorongosa, it's become an initiative that really focuses on people and is driven by people. And it benefits wildlife as a secondary consequence, not the other way around. One of the ways I first got involved in this, Ms. Caldwell, was a concern about wildlife trafficking and its consequences for security. It's something I know my ranking member is also quite concerned about. He and I traveled to Rwanda, and one of the things that we were talking with the national leadership there about was how in eastern DRC and Rwanda and other parts of the world, wildlife trafficking really funds lots of other trafficking of weapons, of drugs, of people, and the financing of terrorism. The law that Senator Flake and I worked on in 2016, the End Wildlife Trafficking Act, authorized the Presidential Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. Senator Portman and I got passed a bill that the President signed into law last year, reauthorizing and extending that. Tell me about USAID's investments in protected areas and its work and its partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service to reduce wildlife trafficking flows, particularly to countries like China and Vietnam, elsewhere in Southeast Asia. What more do you think we could do to combat wildlife trafficking? And how does that connect with the rest of this focus on biodiversity?
Absolutely. Well, we were very pleased that the End Wildlife Trafficking Act was reauthorized in December of 2022 and very much appreciate your leadership on that front. For fiscal 22, approximately $75 million, or 20% of our budget, our biodiversity budget, was allocated to addressing wildlife trafficking. Our focus area is largely on building law enforcement capacity. So ensuring that the rangers are well-trained, ensuring that the forensic scientists have the ability they need, supporting prosecutors and judges to understand best practice in these cases, addressing corruption and transparency, which of course are critical issues, and demand reduction. When it comes to demand reduction, and then there was a reference, I think, from Senator Schatz to this effect, China, of course, looms large, as do other Asian countries. So we've done some very innovative work. In Vietnam, for example, we worked with the business community to ensure that they were messaging to their own colleagues that gifts of rhino horn do not convey elevated status, that there are other ways to convey that status and that appreciation. In Thailand, we worked with monks to ensure that they were communicating with their, with their congregations about the fact that tigers won't ensure the protection that Thais presume they would. Also working on a publicly oriented campaign in Thailand called Only Elephants Wear Ivory. And then again in PRC addressing rhino, ivory, and pangolin. So we try to take a pretty comprehensive look at these problems, and as you've mentioned, it relates very much, of course, to biodiversity because this is wildlife that is on the market, and unless we reduce the demand and address the crimes as they take place, that kind of activity will continue. Likewise, it emphasizes the importance of local livelihoods, which have been so heavily underscored. I myself also had an opportunity to visit Greg Carr and Gorongosa and would absolutely highlight that as best practice. I mean, there's a community of 200,000 people surrounding that park who are getting health care and education and training. And again, that sort of one-of-a-kind investment in leadership. So we really have parks that are managed by and for Africans is so critical.
Let me ask one brief follow-up question, then I'm going to defer to my ranking member. In terms of implementers of that law enforcement training, that's a key piece of countering poaching and ending wildlife trafficking. The SFOS bill requires more active oversight. How's that playing out? How's that working out? Oversight of those who are implementing law enforcement activities. A lot of this happens in very difficult, unstable locations. Eastern DRC, for example, is a difficult place in which to conduct counter-poaching activities because there's a lack of central government control. There's a lot of different warring factions. It's mountainous and remote. How is that oversight going? And then I'll defer to Senator Graham.
Sure. I can give you a brief response, but I'll give you a fuller one for the record. What I know is that there, of course, has been a history at times of the rangers and law enforcement surrounding these parks engage themselves in human rights abuses, and we do quite a lot of training to ensure that that kind of activity doesn't take place. Needless to say, that will undermine community confidence in these parks, and it's critically necessary that we get that right. I also alluded to the work we do to address corruption, which fuels this kind of activity, and that's another critical form of oversight. We have a very strong anti-corruption initiative at USAID that is really focused on elevating best practice in addressing corruption, but also ensuring that we're investing in democratic bright spots to avoid the kind of corruption that really enables wildlife crime. I actually first had my own exposure to this when I was approached by someone who was investigating the trade in Siberian tiger pelts, and they offered to sell him women in the 1990s, and I got involved in an undercover campaign on the Russian mafia's involvement. So it also underscores your earlier point, which is that these networks diversify their so-called product base and really represent a threat to national security.
Thank you very much. Let me defer to Senator Graham. Glad to have you join us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of all the things the committee could be focusing on, this is sort of top of our list for a good reason. We just got back from Africa on our CODEL, and what I learned was these parks sort of sanctuaries of governance and law and order surrounded by a lot of upheaval. So if we're up to me, I would have a string of parks, conservation parks, all over Africa, because it may be the only place a community can reside with some level of peace and certainty in terms of the rule of law. Do all of you support the U.S. Foundation for International Conservation Act introduced by Senator Coons and myself?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we do.
Good.
Yes, sir.
Probably why you're here. Now, the goal of Chris and myself is to create a public-private relationship where the private sector sort of leads and puts their money where their mouth is, collaborating with the United States government and other people, hopefully other governments, to make sure that these parks are well managed, that we deal with poaching by force, and that the communities surrounding these parks benefit. Mr. Steer, is that right? Dr. Steer?
Absolutely right, Senator.
So-
we believe this initiative is a very good one. The way you describe it is absolutely right, and there are certain components that will make this very successful. It's if the private sector, as you say, comes in and works together with the public funding, if the emphasis is on long-term, if we think precisely the way you're talking about good governance, but also thinking about citizens who live outside the area who maybe are not able to get the incomes they used to get before. So we've got to be pretty imaginative in order to make sure there are alternative livelihoods. And then we need to monitor very carefully. We now have the capacity using satellite technology to see almost every tree falling. That is very, very valuable information, and we need to be very disciplined. We in the Bezos Earth Fund are very highly engaged in that space, and we are very interested in partnering with you in this new proposed fund.
Well, Dr. Steer, I appreciate that, and to other groups like yours, I'd love to work with you. The goal here, I guess, is to have the local community feel like the park is an asset. Is that correct, everybody? They're nodding their head. Protecting the animals is better business than allowing them to be poached. Everybody's nodding their head, right?
Yes, absolutely. Before your arrival, we discussed the importance of community engagement. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And so when we collect fees for people who visit these parks, we want to make sure that the local community feels the benefit of that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So what I would suggest to my colleagues in Congress, if you want to do something to bring about better governance and a semblance of the rule of law in this part of the world, in these ungoverned spaces, the parks are your best opportunity. Dr. Steer, the Africa Parks, are you familiar with that group?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we believe that they are very expert. I mean, in Africa, there are some very, very good groups. Some are international, non-governmental organizations, many based, they're headquarters in the United States.
But let's explain for the public if we can. Mr., how do you say your last name, sir?
Sebunya, sir.
Okay, so let's walk through real quickly how this works. A group called Africa Parks will take over the park. They will provide security, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Okay, and they will have the capability to fight the poachers, right?
Yes, sir.
And their emphasis is on helping the local community surrounding the park.
I don't know. I don't work for Africa Parks, Senator, but yes, in some cases.
Okay, Dr. Steer, is that sort of generally the way Africa Parks works?
I believe so. Yes, indeed.
Okay, well, the reason I mentioned it's a private sector group, right? Nonprofit. And so what we want to do is that where the government is failing in some of these countries due to corruption or whatever, is to bring something new to the table and hopefully get the government buy-in what we're doing. So like Botswana, they got great parks. The government seems to be buying into this public-private partnership. What I would suggest to the chairman here is not only we pass our bill, but we put the countries in question on notice. We expect you to up your game. We expect you to make sure that the money being generated for all this activity, some of it actually goes to the people. So I'm really excited about how this effort to conserve nature and protect animals actually is probably one of the best antidotes to the spread of terrorism and international criminality. The biggest benefit from this, beyond protecting the wildlife itself, I think is to have a system that can make it harder not only for illegal traffickers and wild poachers, but also people involved in radical activity. And, Mr. Chairman, I think we're on to something here. I think this is you're at USAID, is that right, Ms. Caldwell?
Yes, sir.
Do you consider this a threat to what you do?
No, I don't. I understand you're working to ensure this is additional funding, and of course, we're absolutely supportive of ensuring a further $200 million a year for 10 years for biodiversity conservation.
So it is additional funding, but it's not just additional funding, it's a fundamentally new approach. Dr. Steer, if you could just wrap this up for us, how do you think the private sector will respond to this idea? And should we be optimistic that we're on the right track in terms of the public-private partnerships?
I think the private sector, both the philanthropic private sector and even the for-profit private sector, would respond very, very well to this. And the reason for that is that we are more effective if we work with the public sector. So it's not actually just dollars that we hope you'll be putting into this fund. It is actually influence and engagement. And even now, clearly, when you, Senator Graham, and you, Senator Coons, go on these visits, you meet at the head of state level, you engage, that is incredibly useful. It will be even more useful if we could do it in partnership, whereby when you go, you not only have public money, but actually you're engaged with something much bigger than that, where the private sector is. So whilst we are very, very good at putting money into NGOs, you're very, very good at doing that, plus you're very, very good at engaging at the very head of state. So that's why we're interested in working with you. And it's certainly not just me. In my written testimony, I talked about a group of philanthropists, $5 billion put on the table, not particularly specifically for this particular initiative, but would be very interested in working with you in the design and the implementation.
Thank you, Senator Graham, and thank you to the witnesses. We are going to conclude in just a moment, if I could. One of the examples that Senator Graham and I have talked about is Park W, is an area that is at the intersection, roughly, of northwestern Benin and Togo and southeastern Burkina Faso. Thus, his comments about national parks being sort of an area of potential stability and governance in a region troubled by significant extremism and violence. That's, I think, the concrete example he had in mind there. Obviously, in different countries, the role of the central government, the role of the park in the community, and the intensity of violence or extremism varies wildly across a massive continent with many different examples. Gorongosa was initially destroyed, denuded by an ongoing civil war between Frelimo and Renamo, and as recently as the last visit I made there, there was a renewed violence around the periphery of the park, although at a much, much smaller level than anything we're seeing in Benin. I do think it's important for us to focus on how we would select and prioritize. There are many potential NGO implementing partners. African Parks is one that has a strong record, but there are many others, not just in Africa, but throughout the Global South. And the design elements that, frankly, all three of you testified to and agreed on: the importance of long-term funding, the importance of clear metrics and accountability that have conservation and biodiversity goals, as well as economic improvement and stability goals. The importance of engaging the public, private, and philanthropic sectors so that the power of the U.S. government and potentially other close allied partner governments in terms of providing security assistance and advice, mobilizing national leadership in partner countries, can't be overstated. And then, as we've talked about throughout this hearing today, the critical role of having not just a seat at the table, but a driving part of how things are designed and led. African voices, to the extent we're talking about the African continent, as well as indigenous communities in the rest of the world. One last point, Senator Schatz referenced a marine park. Bazarudo Archipelago off of southeastern Mozambique is another I visited. It's important to be clear that I'm imagining this as not just land, but also sea, and at the intersection. There's critical challenges in terms of pirate fishing or IUU fishing, marine debris, plastic debris that USAID is also making real contributions, is taking a real leadership position in. There's so much more we could talk about this. I must go to question and vote. I will invite each of you, if you would choose to make a brief concluding comment, and then I will conclude this hearing. Ms. Caldwell, a closing comment of any kind?
Sure. Without reiterating anything I've already said, I just want to underscore the power and potential of this, of the government partnership as a critical component of this nexus. When you go on your CODELs, ensuring that you're bringing the ministers of finance and economic development and tourism into the conversation, since this is all too often sequestered in the environment ministry, which doesn't have the funding or the power that many of those others do. And of course, USAID's history of 6 decades on the ground and having built those very strong partnerships with government that traverse various administrations, the work we do on the enabling environment to ensure the appropriate policies and regulations that would enable the success of an investment the Conservation Foundation might make is so important. So I appreciate the fact that the Act calls for seats on the board from a range of U.S. government entities, including state and USAID, who have on-the-ground contacts that can be very relevant in helping ensure the success of your investments and evaluating the potential of them before they're made. Thank you.
I might also add the ministries of health, education, and agriculture.
Of course.
Because focusing on human development also means bringing those on board as well.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Sabunya.
Thank you, Senator. I think I would just again repeat our support to the Foundation for International Conservation Act, and that we believe that it has a potential to be transformative influence to the international conservation landscape, and especially the things that Senator, you touched on, and the ranking member also touched on, that really conservation is not about, is not an end in itself. That conservation needs to have to meet the aspirations of people on the African continent. It's a political and a cultural heritage issue, and that the leadership and the voices and the perspectives of the Africans is going to be so critical in the success of this entity. The last thing I'll say is the role of the private sector. I really personally believe that in the long run, the NGOs are going to give way to the private sector in running and managing the entities of our wildlife, and within the protected areas and outside the protected areas. It's very, very critical.
I think it's essential that in the long run, conservation, the protection of biodiversity, wildlife, be seen as a central part of competent development strategies by nations all over the world. If that ultimately, not in competition, but really reinforcing each other, if we can achieve that, we can have done something significant. Dr. Steer, close us out, if you would.
This is a historic opportunity. Never has the need been greater, but also never have we known as much about what works and what doesn't work. We actually do know how to do this, and it requires a very unusual type of partnership, ranging from those who are indigenous people in the forest, to those who are trying to make a living outside the forest, to politicians at the highest level, to the business community. We now have a business community globally that's very interested in this issue. We have philanthropists that are very interested in this issue. The fact that we have you, Senator, and a bipartisan initiative in the U.S. Congress is a great blessing, and we really are honored to be your partner in this.
Thank you. Thank you all. I look forward to our ongoing partnership in this. You've given us great input about how to think about as we move forward with this legislation and with writing the FY24 appropriations bill for the subcommittee. The hearing record will remain open for written questions until 5 p.m. on Tuesday, May 9th. Thank you all, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.